Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Hugh Jackman reprises his role as Wolverine one more time in Logan. The year is 2029 and an aging Logan, played by Hugh Jackman, with the help of Stephen Merchant's Caliban, takes care of Charles Xavier, played by Patrick Stewart, whose dementia makes his psychic powers dangerously unstable. Most mutants are now dead, but Xavier senses a new mutant named Laura, played by Daphne Keane, who is very much like Logan in her abilities, and Logan and Xavier go on the road to take her towards a supposed Eden, while trying to keep ahead of the sinister forces pursuing her, led by Boyd Holbrook's Pierce. Hugh Jackman has been the one constant in all the X-Men films. The original was his star-making role back in 2000, and he's played the character 9 times in 17 years in virtually every single X-Men film, even if it was just a cameo, with the exception of Deadpool, where it's referenced so many times he might as well have starred in it anyway. And his commitment to the part has never wavered, even if the films really aren't to the same quality as his performance, and this was especially true when the character started getting solo spin-offs. The first, X-Men Origins Wolverine, a studio-mandated origin story, is easily the worst of the X-Men film franchise to date. The second, which was apparently the one they wanted to do the first time around, the Wolverine, sent the character to Japan and was a much more character-based story, and tried to make him more human and vulnerable by removing his healing ability. But even with that, it still felt like it was compromised because it had to make concessions to the superhero genre, so every so often the story would get interrupted by a fight scene on top of a bullet train or against a robot samurai that really went against the intentions of the movie. They hadn't really cracked the character properly on screen as a solo entity, and this was because the previous films were all PG-13, so you couldn't have the violent berserker rages that were depicted in the comic books. But with Hugh Jackman deciding to hang up his claws because he's getting at the point now where he is starting to outgrow the role of someone who regenerates with a healing ability, they've decided to actually go full on with it this time and give the fans exactly what they want. And if you're one of those people that has been waiting for a full-blooded, R-rated Wolverine movie, you will not be disappointed. This is the one you've been waiting for. There's a stark difference between Logan and many other movies in the superhero genre. Yes, there have been R-rated comic book properties before, like Deadpool or Watchmen, but they still felt like a part of the genre, just with more adult content in them, whereas Logan really cuts off and does something truly mature with it. It's not simply a matter of violence and swearing, although there is plenty of it right from the outset, so don't take your children to see this movie. When we meet Logan at the beginning of this movie, he's very much at his lowest ebb. He's a limousine driver in Texas. He's really only working because he needs money for the medication for Xavier, who is in hiding across the border. He's a very bitter, broken, battered man. His face is sun-scorched and burnt, and his body is filled with wounds and scars that haven't really healed properly because his healing ability is starting to decline. Even his claws aren't coming out in the same way that they used to. You get the sense that he's not a well man, and he's in real agonising pain. He's driven to the bottle even more so than we've seen previously in these films, and there's a real sense that the very fibre of his being is destroying him, figuratively and literally, because his adamantium skeleton is really taking its toll on his compromised immune system. And in the role, Jackman has never been better. This is his finest hour, and he gives a performance that's both very bitter, and that's where a lot of those, added F words really come in handy, but also very vulnerable and human and really melancholic. It very much sets the tone for this movie that's quite a slow burner, really. It has more to do with westerns than it really does with the superhero genre, and you can really see that in the visual style of the movie. Much of the film is set in these really barren desert landscapes that really gives the film a very post-apocalyptic feel, even if it isn't explicitly set in that sort of environment, because there's obviously still cityscapes that we see, but there's a sense that the world that Logan and Xavier inhabit is coming to an end. The two movies that very much spring to mind when you're watching Logan is Shane and Unforgiven, and you can very much feel the death of Unforgiven in the way that Logan is characterised in this movie. He's always felt very Clint Eastwood-like, but never more so than he does here. The character has very obvious parallels to William Money in Unforgiven, in that both of them are tormented by their past and the people that they used to be, the people that they've failed to save, and the lives they've taken, and the fact that they've become legends begrudgingly. And people know who Wolverine is in this movie. They know him by his reputation and even by his adventures that have been adapted into the comic books in largely fictionalised form, as he cynically tells X-23 later in the movie. But there is this sense that he's burdened by the man that he used to be, because he's not as fast and as sharp as he used to be, but also because he has to deal with all the sins that he's taken. That's where Shane comes in. Shane is very explicitly referenced in the film, to the point where the characters even sit down and watch it in their hotel room, and the quote from the movie, "There's no living with the killing," very much reverberates throughout the entire movie. And there's a real sense in this film that the violence that Logan has had to dish out in all these movies has haunted him. And it really helps that the violence in this movie, yes, it's quite cathartic, especially if you're a comic book fan who has been really waiting for these movies to get really violent and bloody. But there's something really quite disturbing about it as well. The way that claws penetrate through heads and cheeks, and limbs are severed clean off, as well as heads, and faces are blown off with shotguns. This movie is incredibly violent, and really quite uncomfortably so at certain points. Blood and gore is flying everywhere. You can understand why that would be so traumatic. I do think the movie has a very conflicted relationship when it comes to its violence, because it is a wide release comic book movie. There are certain moments in it that are played as being crowd pleasing, which occasionally rubs uncomfortably against the main themes of the movie, that violence and death, they take a toll on the soul. But for the most part, you really feel the weight and the impact of all this aggression, and just simply because the arterial sprays across the screen, it's in some ways quite shocking, even after watching Deadpool, because a lot of the violence in that was very cartoonish. This is very much down to earth, very brutal, and in some cases quite unpleasant. This is a very grim, emotional movie where horrible things happen to good, innocent people just because they happen to get in the way. And it's especially so if you're a long-time X-Men fan who has been following the film series and seeing the characters like this, not just Logan, but also Xavier. Patrick Stewart reprises his role once more, but it's very different this time out. The character is normally represented as this very buttoned down voice of dignity and authority, and here, because of his dementia, a lot of that has been taken away. You still see flashes of the wise, kindly man that he used to be, and he's still trying to take care of Logan, who occasionally he doesn't even recognise, but it's sometimes really difficult to watch because of Stewart's very accurate portrayal of someone who is struggling against their own mind. His most powerful weapon has turned against him to a certain extent, and it's genuinely upsetting to witness at some points, seeing him beg for Logan not to medicate him. He's suffering these debilitating seizures, but not just him. When he suffers a seizure, everyone else around him feels it as well, and he could have potentially devastating results. And he, like Logan, is also having to deal to a certain extent with the consequences of his actions. I'm making this sound like it's a very tough movie, and it is, but it's not without certain moments of levity. I think Stewart recognises that to a certain extent in his performance, because there are moments in this movie where Xavier does something uncharacteristic. in his behaviour, be it swearing or sticking his tongue out like this, and that's funny because it's so surprising to witness with the character, but it adds a welcome moment of humour to the proceedings. Stephen Merchant in the earlier scenes of the movie also provides a little bit of levity for the audience as Caliban, who is an albino mutant who can track other mutants, and he's also taking care of Xavier when Logan isn't around. This is a much more serious role for Merchant than you would normally see him play, but he still has moments of humour that just, make sure the movie isn't completely morose. This is very much a character piece, and that's one of its biggest strengths, and really sets it apart from the other X-Men movies, which are these huge ensemble casts, whereas here, because it's closed off future setting, and it's relatively small cast of mutant characters, it's allowed to tell something a lot more personal and deeper, with this family dynamic between Logan and Charles and Laura. And I haven't spoken about Laura yet. Daphne Keene's performance in this film is fantastic for a child actor in a really demanding part, because so much of the movie is basically carried by her presence alone, really. She has very little dialogue, and most of the time it's just a look or a glance. It's just something about her that registers as being special, but also very dangerous and unstable to a certain degree. A child has an unsettled temper to begin with, let alone one that has the characteristics of Wolverine, and you can feel that in the scenes. There's always a sense that you never quite know when she might attack, and it's really interesting to see the dynamic with her and the villains, where they're actually really genuinely frightened by what an 11-year-old girl can do to them, and with good reason. It's a really challenging role because of that, but at the same time it still feels like a kid. She still feels like someone who is learning about the world, because she's spent most of her life in a lab. She doesn't really interacted with people properly, and so everything feels new and unfamiliar, and there is a sense that she's enjoying exploring and pushing her boundaries to a certain extent. And it's great to see the dynamic between all three of these characters, where Charles starts to take care of Laura when Logan refuses to really acknowledge her. He doesn't really want to make connections because of his past, but Laura manages to wake something inside of him. Going back to that Western theme, that sense of the old gunslinger doing right by her. That's how he initially starts to come into this relationship, is that he feels obligated to do right by her, not for himself, but for her. And that relationship through the movie is its real emotional core as he learns to accept her throughout the running time. As much as I praise this movie, it isn't perfect. At 137 minutes, it does feel like it's a little bit too long, and it does feel like it drags a little in the middle, especially when the movie slows down as Logan, Laura and Charles go on a farm to visit a family led by Eric LaSalle. And that section of the movie, it's great for character development, but at the same time it does feel like it's a little bit too baggy in that section, and it loses a lot of its momentum at that point. But really its biggest problem is those concessions to the superhero genre, because it still has to make them, and that's where the movie really falls down there, because it feels very half-hearted. You can tell that the filmmakers really didn't have their heart in this area of the movie. Boyd Holbrook as Piers, for example, he makes a great first impression in the earliest hour of this movie, with his bionic hand and his sunglasses and his weaselly, really quite hateful demeanour. This is the sort of bad guy that really could have been quite an effective antagonist during the movie, but unfortunately he quickly gets sidelined and in favour of Richard E. Grant of all people. And no offence to Richard E. Grant, but his character feels like it's strayed out of a completely different movie with its conspiracy subplot. He feels like a very much token villain character, and some of his performance does feel like it's a little bit too over the top for a film like this, really. The conspiracy plot that's tied to Laura is played out quite subtly, and I like the idea of it playing subtly, in that it's just sort of scattered piecemeal through the movie, but really it does feel like it's pushed far too much into the background. Literally, one of the major indicators of it in the plot is just on a television screen in the back of a bar in one scene, just if you happen to catch it there. And there is a nugget of an interesting idea there, but really I'm not sure if I wanted a film that focused more upon that, especially because what we have between Jackman and Stewart and Keane is so fantastic, especially towards the film's final scenes. I think most will find where the movie wraps up to be very emotionally satisfying, and they won't really care about the fact that the villains or certain areas of the plot are a little bit maybe forced or underdeveloped. The movie accomplishes its aim, which is to provide closure for the actor, the character, and the audience, really. Deadpool may have opened the floodgates for R-rated comic book movies, and I don't think Logan could have been made without it, but I think this is the first truly adult, mature superhero film that we've had to date, and it's one that deserves to change the way that we look at superhero movies and the way they're made. It's a really ambitious, really interesting, and fantastically performed piece of drama. Not just superhero movie, it's a great drama on its own terms. Claws for all the memories, Hugh. Logan is a strong fall outing for Hugh Jackman in his star-making role, and he's never been better in the part now that he's been cut loose from the constraints of a PG-13 rating and allowed to show the character in all his violent and visceral glory. Taking its cue from the Western genre, this is one of the most mature superhero outings to date, not simply because of its content, but its real grit in terms of themes and emotion. There's a strong emphasis on character as Logan confronts his humanity and guilt, which also gives room for a great film debut for Daphne Keane and Patrick Stewart as a very different version of Xavier than we've seen previously. The film does sag a little in the middle, and it's not entirely free from concessions to the superhero genre, notably the villain's conspiracy plot that's kept largely to the background, but this is the film that Wolverine deserves and the one the fans have been waiting for. I'm going to try catching up on some films that I've missed in my next few videos, but until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.